Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to The Open Door. Jim Hannick here with co-host Matthew Bartko and friends John Breen and, we think, Jack Quirk. Our special guests today are Skylar Covich and Ron Austin and Mario Ramos Reyes. He of Paraguay, a philosopher, un abogado, and a Maritanista par excellence. We will begin, as always, with a prayer. Direct, we beseech thee, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, that every prayer and work of ours may begin always from thee, and by thee be happily ended. Today we'll pause, and only pause, in our analysis of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, because of our special guests. We'll begin, and Matthew Bartko will lead us here, with our good friend Skylar Covich. Matthew?
Thanks, Jim. Good morning, Skylar. Thanks for joining us again.
Good morning, Matthew. Thank you for having me on again.
You're very welcome. I wanted to pick up a little bit of where we left off when we unfortunately lost you in the last show, and give you a chance to talk about some of the changes that have happened in the American Solidarity Party lately, namely a slate of candidates that you supported and campaigned for, even though you yourself were not up for re-election, won a sweep of the open national committee positions for the American Solidarity Party in our recent convention. And I believe they have now voted and made you the new chair of the party. So if you could tell us a little bit more about the so-called contract slate and anything that will be changing, and perhaps more importantly, anything that won't be changing as a result of this election, that would be great.
Right. So some of the main goals of the contract are to increase the number of candidates and provide more support to those candidates from the time that they announced that they're going to be interested in campaigning. I talked about that a bit last week before I had technical difficulties. So that's going to be a big change. We're also going to make it easier for new state chapters or dormant state chapters to get established with new leadership. The last national committee had thought that it was necessary to have a more extensive screening process, and we understand that state leaders do need to be vetted to some extent. We don't want someone who's going to be going outside of the party platform and that sort of thing. But we believe that, generally speaking, it should be easy to get a state chapter going. That the National Committee should be more about guiding state chapters rather than enforcing a specific interpretation of the party's platform. And we're also changing our social media strategy a bit. So, people will be welcome to start ASP groups that are about specific subjects. We kind of want to know what are the specific groups that are out there, but people will be welcome to start them. And I think the public content of our social media will shift a bit, and already has. We are still figuring out exactly what would be the most effective. So, as far as what won't be changing, we'll still, the platform is going to remain the same. There probably will be a discussion about it in 2020. Everybody, which I think was always going to be the case, no matter who was on the national committee. And we want to welcome everybody who has been in the party up to this point, or who agrees with the party's platform and would like to come in to reach out to us. So we're always glad to assist you in figuring out where your talents would best be served in growing the party, whether that's with your state chapter, or writing for the new blog that we're starting, or setting up materials for our candidates or our state chapters. I think there's a place for everyone.
That is exciting news, in particular about the candidates and getting some more people involved in the state chapters.
Yes.
So, if I understand correctly, nothing's changing about the platform until, if things go according to plan, the 2020 convention, where we'll be considering our next presidential nominee.
Yes, that's the plan.
Excellent. Good to hear. Now, I realize that listeners of this show are going to be, a little more familiar than the average American with the term Christian democracy. It's something we've devoted a lot of time talking about. And one of our regular guests, Jack Quirk, actually writes a blog and has another radio show on this radio station by that name, Christian Democracy. I would love it if you would give us your take on just what is Christian democracy, and or in particular in the American context with the American Solidarity Party.
Yes, so Christian democracy is a very difficult term to unpack in the American context, because people disagree about what it is. I think that is somewhat the case now in Europe and Latin America as well, but especially in the U.S., there are people who think that they're not Christian Democrats when they might actually be. And then there are people who think that they are Christian Democrats when they might actually be more outside that tradition. And there are people who think that Christian Democrats are members of the Democratic Party who are Christian, which is certainly not the case, although there might be some left in the Democratic Party. And so people might have a positive or negative opinion of that term, depending on their impressions of it. From a policy perspective, there are also significant disagreements about their calibrating how to deal with issues around the LGBT movement, what specific federal programs should be required in order to assist the poor, how much regulation of business, foreign policy, lots of different disagreements. That being said, the Christian democratic tradition has a lot to teach us. The basic idea, I would summarize it, is that both unbridled capitalism and socialism without any allowance for private property are not going to work at all. The government needs to be involved in the economy, because otherwise it's simply going to be a disaster. There's, the business, the free market is not going to be able to take care of the poor without some regulation. But that being said, the family is the central unit of society. We want to make sure that we are promoting a society where the family values are supported. And also life from conception to natural death, a very important part of this. which means opposition to abortion and opposition to capital punishment and opposition to assisted suicide. So to the extent that Christian democracy is a helpful term for that, that's very good. There are some Christian democratic think tanks. Much of the Catholic social teaching, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and other Catholic organizations, could be said to be Christian democratic. And then there's some more explicitly Christian democratic think tanks, especially in the Reformed tradition, like the Center for Public Justice, that we definitely want to network with. But if other party members want to identify themselves as distributists or advocates of the consistent life ethic, then that should be welcomed as well.
Thanks so much, Skylar. I really appreciate hearing your thoughts on that, and we were happy to get them in at the top of the hour this time, just because you were cut off a little bit last week. I'm going to turn the show over to our regular lead host. I'm just a co-host, so we'll turn it over to the one that everyone dials in to listen to, the infamous Jim Hannock.
Thanks, Matthew. Before we let Skylar sit back at all, I'd like to ask Mario, our friend, if Skylar's comments about Christian democracy connect with your idea of Christian democracy, since you have a background in Latin America.
Good morning, everyone. I think, yes, coincide with many of the ideas that in Latin America the Christian Democrat have believed and implemented over many years. Now, there is a fact that today the Christian Democratic ideal or proposal is mainly forgotten in Latin America, particularly in the 1970s with the rise of liberation theology and different leftist movement in general. I would suggest that if we look at the vast panorama, not only in Europe, but in Latin America, Christian democracy always began not with established political parties, began with movements. And the word movement, I think, is very significant, the meaning of the word movement in this tradition, because it's a set of ideals that move people. And move people not because they understand what is at stake, the public policy, rather there is an affection, there is an attraction. And this attraction began with the Christian experience. So all political parties, well-established political parties in Latin America, the Chilean Christian Democrats or at one point the Venezuelan Christian Democrat and many others began with movements. And when this movement reached to a point of maturity, they began establishing political structures and began running for office. And I think this is key if one wants to establish a set of public policy that we can call Christian Democratic. Everything began with a movement. Another point I think is important is that the term Christian democracy, as was established in Latin America in 1960, which perhaps a decade where they reached to its peak, was called revolution in liberty. Revolution because, well, we can say that everyone in 1960 wanted to be a revolutionary. But the key issue in that name was liberty. In other words, Christian Democrat tried to reconcile certain institutions, which were what we may call liberal institutions, the rule of law, check and balances, and the like, with the idea of social justice. And this is a very difficult sometimes balance, because on the one hand, you had many traditions which emphasize the role of the state and in the name of justice, equality, and just put aside or postpone liberty. And on the other, you had those systems which were highly individualistic and just had forgotten completely about justice. So the idea of revolution in liberty, I think, is key to understand this tradition. I would start with that. And another and final point that I can make here is that central to Christian democracy was the idea of the person. It's a personalist democracy. It's not just the individual. It's not just society. I think there is interaction. There is a human being who understand that he is human being because he's belong to a community. The community is not only something contractual, it's something that is based upon certain affections. And so I would propose this explanation, I think, as to begin our conversation.
Thanks very much, Mario. I find that very, very helpful.
Yes.
Our resident Christian democracy friend, Jack Quirk, has just joined us, and I'm sure he'll have a chance to join us in the conversation shortly. I will make this transition from Mario to our dear friend Ron Austin with one question. Mario, would you say that Jacques Maritain has anything to do with this?
Of course. There is very long scholarship, if I would call that, that show that Maritain in the 1930s and late 20s, 30s, and 40s was instrumental in creating a mindset or a culture that later, a culture that fostered this idea of democratic Christian democracy in Latin America. 1948, there was a conference, a very well-known conference, where all the movements, they were called movement then, from all the main groups in Latin America got together, gathered in Montevideo, in Uruguay, and they set up a set of principles that later led to the formation of some political parties in Chile and Argentina, et cetera, et cetera. And so the ideas of that meeting were laid out mainly by Jacques Maritain, who had visited Latin America before. But was not only Maritain. There were other thinkers, also influential, like Emmanuel Mounier, the French writer and philosopher, and also the Italian tradition. But Maritain was instrumental in the sense that he visited Latin America. His ideas were well known, at least by what then in 1940 was called the quote liberal tradition in the Catholic social teaching. But there is no question about that. Rafael Caldera, who was president of Venezuela in the 1960s and then in the 90s, wrote a very beautiful piece about his relationship with Maritain. Was published by the New Scholasticism of the University of Notre Dame a few years back, where he explained all the nuances and the connection between Maritain ideas and the Christian democratic movement in Latin America.
Thank you very much, Mario. There's a transition here, and Maritain can be the bridge. I came to know Ron Austin, and we're so happy to have Ron with us as our guest this morning because of our mutual interest in Jacques Maritain. Ron Austin has long shared many of the interests and commitments that make for the movement of solidarity. He's been an actor, a producer, an activist, social worker. He's a respected author, and more recently, he's become a fellow of the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology. Now, most recently, Ron has been exploring in the journal First Things let's call them the travails of popular culture, the generation gaps, plural, and what it's like to be the last living member of the Hollywood Blacklist. Ron, you've heard a report now from National Committee Chair Skylar Covich. And in fact, Matthew Bartko has been the National Committee Chair in the past. And you've heard an overview from Mario Ramos Reyes about the tradition, beginning and movements of Christian democracy. Where would you like to connect your interests, those concerns that we have? The floor is open. Feel free.
Well, thank you, Jim. My friend Jim Hannock always raises my pay grade. I want to make it very clear to everyone, and greetings to everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm not a scholar. I'm not an academic. I'm not a historian. I was in show business for 50 years. That either qualifies or disqualifies me for this discussion. I would say, Jim, that I'm 84 years old. I'm an adult convert to Catholicism. I would say that the best that I can offer to a group of this level is simply as a witness. I'm not an analyst. I respond much to what Dr. Reyes said about community and movements, things like that. But my observations of that have been simply as a witness. I would say that if I can offer anything, it is this broader historical perspective of simply my own observations for 60 years of what has changed in American society and what is the significance of those changes. And I think we could view politics or culture and religion itself in the context of those changes. So if you would like, I could indicate a couple of things that I observed, which I think were fairly major changes, if that's suitable to you, Jim.
That's excellent. Go ahead, Ron.
Okay. I would say that I've observed, and again, not from an academic, from a personal point of view, two significant changes in the whole of American society and culture. And the first was nothing less than the end of modernity. Now, Romano Guardini anticipated this prophetically something in 1950. I was a young communist in 1950. I didn't learn that book until decades later. But Guardini's sense that something, and we can debate is how do we define modernity specifically. He sensed that something was coming to an end or had come to an end already in Europe. Now, for me, this was the world that I lived in. This wasn't a theory. And I would describe modernity that was coming to an end and these are broad generalizations, as having two or three characteristics. First was the self-sufficiency of human beings. We no longer needed tradition or God or religion. We were now self-sufficient. We were self-sufficient because we had the capacity for reason, and reason was autonomous. And reason joined with science and then technology would provide a guaranteed future. That future was progress. Progress was, if not inevitable, linear. Now, these were just the attitudes, and I think I'm 84. I may be the last generation of Americans that was really, this was just immersed in us. It wasn't questioned. In high school, in the late 40s, early 50s, this was a given. And I saw that come to an end. Those convictions, they're probably still around rhetorically, but by the end of the 60s, they were over. modernity, the world that I had lived in and grown up, that expected people to be autonomous and based on reason and science and a guaranteed progress. I don't think really anyone really believed that by the end of the 60s. Now, if that's true, if my observation is accurate, then that's enormously significant, I think, for everything we're trying to do now. Let me just add one other significant development that came out of that. And that was something that Walker Percy, who I greatly admire, observed by around 1980. As Percy put it, we have entered the no-name new age. And I think what he meant by that is that we had not only lost the modern culture, we had lost the vocabulary about it. We really no longer had a common intellectual or moral vocabulary to even disagree with each other because the words had lost their meaning. And I think we've been pretty much in that condition for some time. So as a writer and one who dealt with the popular culture, that was highly significant to me. By that time, I had become a Catholic and I left the mass media and had pretty much committed myself to the church ever since. But I think we can now see in what passes for the mass media now this enormous fragmentation and alienation that I think Walker Percy was right in predicting and recognizing. We are all in the no-name new age. And let me just finally say, in that we are all wandering in this desert together, I think we need to be enormously patient and tolerant with all of it, with each other. I don't think any of us has any clear idea for the future. And so let's respect the different options that we may be looking at.
Thank you so much for that, Ron. I'm going to ask various people that are with us today to comment and maybe to ask you some further questions. And I'd like to start with, if you're our elder, with our youngest member, John Breen. John, does Ron's reflection suggest anything that we should pursue together here?
I think he has a point that since we're living in a rather uncertain age, for lack of a better term, that at least a term that I can come up with, it is important to be able to listen to other people, take in what they're saying, and take some of it to heart. Because we're all in this together. This is the only world we've got, there's no getting out of it. And there was one author, I can't remember his name. He said, "No one's coming out of this earth alive." So, our salvation and the sake of our souls kind of depends on it. And that we're very much a community people. We're social animals. And by that we are political beings to a certain extent. So it's really important to be able to live in community. No person is autonomous. So that's just kind of my take on the view there.
That's a really important theme to emphasize. Let's ask Jack Quirk, who engages in public discourse on many fronts, what he has to say.
Well, what I was reminded of as Ron was talking was just the fact that so much communication today seems to be people talking past each other, largely because words themselves seem to lack any definite meaning. I was just writing something about. I was just writing something about the word socialism, and I jokingly referred to it as the S word. And the reason why I jokingly so refer to it is because of the fact that it's something that seems to mean so many different things to different people, sometimes opposite things. And I raise that just because that's what's been going through my mind recently. But the fact that we are unable to communicate, it's almost as if we have a Tower of Babel going on here, at least in the United States, because of the fact that we cannot communicate with each other because words are more or less weapons
That
They're
really
weapons rather than windows.
underscores our difficulty. I want to just ask Ron to give us some insight into how you worked out your ideas for the journal First Things. First Things itself is in the middle of a culture war or a series of culture wars, and it has very different constituencies. I've noted that on Facebook exchanges for the American Solidarity Party, some people have cited it, and other people have replied, I try never to read that. Now, I suspect, Ron, that you gave a great deal of thought about how to convey what you think is important as a witness in a journal like First Things, and that would give us a concrete focus to consider.
Well, again, Jim, I'm writing out of experience, not out of theory. I hope I thought about it seriously, but I was really reflecting my own experience. And I'm a little concerned that what I've said and what I'm going to add now it sounds awfully negative. I think we have to be realistic about we are in the Tower of Babel, and the other two commentators have kind of affirmed that. So I don't want to be just negative. There are some positive things that I can see happening, but what I was describing for First Things, the title of it was The Myth of Pop Culture. And I think it's important for people to realize that one of the words that is now being misused and mistranslated is culture itself. Eliot pointed out back in the 30s that anyone using the word culture should be required not only to define it, but give an example of it. So it was already at risk even then. And out of my experience in Hollywood, I wanted people to be aware of what we call pop culture or popular culture was neither. It wasn't popular in the sense that it's like folk culture that came out. It was maybe enjoyed by a lot of people, but it didn't come from them. And it wasn't a culture, it was a product. We were producing it. So pop culture is really the commodification of values, is turning it into products. And I think it was just valuable for people to realize that sometimes disguised by the rhetoric we use. But I would argue right now that American society does not have a culture. It has a marketplace. For those of you that are valiantly working in the political arena, I think you have a difficult starting point in terms of where are you going to find the moral foundation for your politics if indeed the culture itself is missing? I pose this as a friendly question, but I don't think there's going to be any viable politics without an underlying culture to it, a framework of a way of life, a way of sharing ideas and values. So I posed that as a question, and that was the thrust of what I was trying to get at in the first thing.
Let me redirect your question. to Skylar. Has what Ron's been saying made you think that your work is going to be easier or maybe harder than you thought?
Yes, it's. I've definitely noticed some similar difficulties. So the decline in our discourse, the inability to listen to each other. I'll be honest and say that this has been a struggle for the American Solidarity Party. There are people who probably do agree on 80%. It becomes hard to deal with disagreements on social media. Part of the problem is that, many people, myself included, end up feeling like they need to defend friends who themselves are being misunderstood. And so it becomes almost like a World War I scenario with entangling alliances. And, that makes it hard to, bring the movement to its full potential when that sort of thing happens. As far as the development of culture, so because the party is largely online, there are meetings in person that happen, but even those are largely the same people most of the time. There are very few people who are, at least to my knowledge, who are not involved in the party online, but who do go to in person. There has been a development of cultural interests and education about some of the moral foundations of our politics through those online groups, and for many, myself included, that's been of great benefit. But the question is, how do we translate that into the communities, whether that be other online spaces where which don't agree with us on many things, or it may be even more importantly, getting people in our communities interested in that. I would say myself, I pretty much never talked about politics to anybody in my apartment complex or my community, a few friends from church, and that's it, because it's hard to even know how to start the conversation from the same, even the same assumptions.
Let me switch now, Skylar, for a minute to Matthew. Yes.
Jim, may I?
Sure.
Just for a moment, sure. May I ask Skylar a question?
Sure. Yes, please.
Skylar, you were represented as the youngest of the group here. One of the positive things I've found. Okay, well, whoever is, everybody's younger than I am, so anyone can contribute to this. One of the positive things I've found, I've had some recent meetings with some young Catholics, and these are people in their 30s and 40s, but I find this emerging generation of my grandsons in their 20s, I find them culturally deprived, but open. Yes. Much less cynical than their parents. I find them more of a searching generation. Now, if that's true, that's very encouraging. I was just wondering if that's been your experience as well.
I think among Catholics, I've noticed that as well. When it comes to people, please remember that an increasing majority of people in their 20s and 30s do not go to church, and with some exceptions, I think there might be a little bit less cynicism, but there's also more apathy, which is a concern.
Jim.
Yes.
Jim, about what Ron said, I think is very crucial. He said he's speaking about from his own experience. And I think he's right. That was the beginning of the Christian democratic movement. You don't start from ideas. Because if you start from ideas or from a discourse, you start from an ideology. And if you start from an ideology, it's very hard for anyone to get to agree with every single point. You start from your heart. You start from an encounter. And in that sense, the term used by Ron, I think, is very accurate, I think, and I love it. You start when a witness away your own eye. And that witness, at least for me, has been Maritain. And Maritain in his own life, he never began with ideas. He began with an encounter. His conversion was an encounter when he didn't know anything about the Christian faith or Thomism of any intellectual pursuit. He encountered a poet, Léon Blois. So my experience has been over the past 25, 30 years of teaching is that millennials generally, they are eager to encounter someone who helped them to discover what they already searching, their desire for justice or freedom. And when we come and try to make a case or give a discourse, we fail. We need somehow to be empathetic with their own search and be witness so that they discover by themselves. And we just are someone who may have some more experience, but that's it. And I think that is the central, I think, aspect of what modernity is all about, or what's no longer modernity. Because when I hear the word modernity, also modernity is an abstraction. What exists is a human being who is searching for truth, who is fragmented, who doesn't have a meaning, and that person needs someone to witness so that that person can find himself. And the last point on this is Jacques Maritain never denied friendship to anyone, even though that person was completely in the opposite of his own belief. When you read the letters that he sent to Saul Alinsky, how Saul Alinsky was moved by Maritain, and they were completely on the opposite side, because Maritain was looking for the heart of Alinsky, not for his ideas or try to make a rebuttal of his ideas. And so I think this is the starting point.
Yes.
If I may jump in, I think that we have a problem in our discourse currently where we've been trained, whether it be by our media or whether it be by just the ethos of our age, seems to be more drawn toward what divides us than what unites us. One of my favorite things about the American Solidarity Party is we require everyone who joins to make an affirmation statement. We require they affirm the sanctity of human life, the necessity of social justice, our responsibility for the environment, and the possibility of a more peaceful world. And that statement gets criticized as being far too loose as to be meaningless. However, I think there is a lot of important meaning to it, and I think it's more than any other political party requires of their members. All a Republican or Democrat has to do is say, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat when they go to vote. I think that if you look at what we are affirming and what the foundation of our party is, and you look at whether it be the Democrats for Life or the conservative evangelicals in the Republican Party, you can find these ideas of consistent life ethic, of stewardship for the environment, of really wanting a socially just society. It are really widespread ideas and ones that aren't consistently held by either of the major parties, let alone when you get down to the libertarians or the Greens. So I really think that while it is hard because it goes countercultural, for example, the American Solidarity Party is silent on the issue of gay marriage. It is silent on the issue of guns outside of affirming the Bill of Rights. We're choosing not to focus on these culture war divisive issues that stray from the concept of the inherent dignity of every human life as expressed through our affirmation statement, because we want to be focusing on what unifies us. And if we can present that unifying message that come together and let's do the work we can all agree on. I mean, everyone in the country says that an investment in infrastructure is an investment in our future, and it just makes sense to pay for infrastructure improvements. We need to rally around those ideas. That there are very few people in this country that want abortion completely legalized to the nth degree, and there are very few people in this country that want it made illegal to the nth degree, even if it costs the life of the mother. We have consensus. We have areas we agree on in this country. The vast majority of our culture agrees on. And I think the role the American Solidarity Party can play is by gathering people who can make that affirmation statement and getting them focused on the areas where we have consensus. That could be dramatically politically powerful. And as the money and as the new members keep pouring in, I'm really hoping that we will do that hard work of getting people to stop focusing on their differences and get the work done where we have the consensus. I think that's really where the hope is for Christian democracy in the United States right now.
Matthew, I was very much hoping you would say those things. You've been a consistent bridge builder from my perspective in the work of the party. I'd like to make an etymological point and a philosophical point, and then I will have made far too many points already, and we could have a kind of open forum. I was going to mention to Mario, and thinking that Mario would connect with this right away, that witness comes from, well, ultimately its concept connects with martyros, martyr. If we're going to be witnesses, and witnesses to the truth in the scriptural sense, we will oftentimes find ourselves martyrs. And that's just a hard truth. The philosophical point is that much of our discussion about the slipperiness of words, the infuriating, exasperating slipperiness of words, takes us back to a central debate in Western philosophy, the question of nominalism. Aristotle would say that everything is what it is and not another thing. But the nominalists, starting in the late Middle Ages and continuing through, say, to sources very close to our culture like John Locke, nominalists would say, well, everything, what is everything? Nothing is really what it is. And if something is what it is, we don't really know what that is. All we have are words, nomen, nomina, names. All we have are names. And the names at best can refer to patterns, but the patterns are always changing, so the names are always changing, or at least the meanings of the terms are always changing. And one of the things that Maritain insisted on was a basic, fundamental philosophical realism. We have access to reality. We don't have a comprehensive grasp of it, but we have access to reality. We can know essential things in ways that enable us to speak. And did we not have that realistic connection with what the good Lord has made, we would really be lost. Our discourse would come to an end. But enough of that sort of background. I guess it's time for Jack Quirk to say something. Jack, I'm sure you've been tuned in here.
Well, oh yeah, I've been listening to this conversation with fascination. What occurs to me in this is that, and I'm afraid that I'm going to have to, I hope this doesn't sound too cynical, but when it comes to words as they are used in economic, social, and political discourse, too often they are just simply, well, they're meaningless. They don't, and the intention isn't so much to convey meaning, but to declare interest. In other words, and perhaps we've been trained to think this way, but the whole democratic polity seems to be that we try to assert our interests within the larger group, and everything that's said, it may come up, it may manifest itself in philosophical dress, but it's really a declaration of interest. And that, I think, is something that has caused us to lose a sense of meaning with respect to discourse, because too often, the things that are said have nothing to do with making a larger point, whether it's nominalism or whether it's realism or any of these things, but rather to compete for resources. In other words, the things that Marx said about philosophy turned out to be a self-fulfilling prophecy self, the self in this case being the society that he was criticizing, it ends up being a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that as we divorce ourselves from any central meaning, any central truth, the meaning behind words becomes nothing more than that materialist grab bag that was warned about, and that's the problem, because when we were talking about earlier about the Tower of Babel, when language descends to that level, what you end up with is just that. People are talking past each other. They're all asserting their interest, and there's nothing central. There's no central truth towards which everybody can refer. And those are the thoughts that have been going through my mind as I listened to this very fascinating discussion this morning.
Those are important thoughts. I'd like to connect with Skylar here. Skylar, you too, as is the case with Ron, you are an adult convert. I wonder if in your conversion you've found a kind of center, a center that otherwise is so lacking for so many.
Yes, certainly. And that I would note, the American Solidarity Party has a lot of converts to either between different Christian denominations, or in a few cases, I didn't really grow up Christian at all. I grew up with my mom being interested in a lot of Eastern religions, and then I became Catholic in college. So my wife has said that conversion experiences are the currency of the ASP. So, it's a discussion that often comes up. It may be that people who have a religious conversion might have a bit more interest in these kinds of political projects, even though they're small. It's most important to stand up for what's right and what is truthful, even if it's difficult. I would say that through my experiences in the church, I have been able to access, some of the, culture of the past, as well as some of the most edifying, I guess, things going on in our contemporary culture. And, some of that is through the online communities, but also through my real life friendships. It's been a great blessing to be a part of that, as well as, of course, the ancient and the sacramental parts of the religion.
Let me go from Skylar, whose comments are, as always, very helpful, to John Breen. John, you've just finished an undergraduate program at Holy Apostles College and Seminary, and that's the stomping grounds of our producer, Dr. Sebastian Mahfoud. I wonder, John, to what extent does the education you've had connect you with the work that needs to be done and enrich your resources for doing that work?
I would say yes. My major was in theology and English and the humanities. So, and the journey didn't really start at Holy Apostle. It started, 3 years prior to that in Canada, where I was on campus there. And that's where I first got exposed to Catholic social teaching, basically the ethical practices in a workplace. And that's kind of what stimulated my interest. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to pursue theology, in order to learn more about the church's teaching on moral and social issues, not just the what, but really the why behind it. And so kind of my goal was to become a little more educated in those realms, maybe have a little more knowledge than the average Catholic in the pew, and then just be able to explain that to people who are outside of the church, either those within the Catholic Church who, like the lay faithful, who may know certain elements of moral and social issues. They may know somewhat of the church's teaching on what it is, but not so much the why. And also for people who are outside the Catholic Church, amongst our Protestant brethren, or people who are not even believers. So that was more or less my the motivation, you might say, to my furthering theology. But Holy Apostles was a pretty good place where it confirmed all that. It was an opportunity for me to apply what I already previously learned and to apply it in a practical way towards other subjects.
Now, if I understand you, the beginning point was really experience, but experience in work contexts. And a thinker who's enormously important and is just as old as Ron Austin is Alistair McIntyre. And a number of us, in one way or another, have become familiar with his writings. Again and again, in looking for points of restructuring the culture, McIntyre talks about the practices that we are engaged in with a special eye to crafts and enterprises that call for really teamwork and team spirit. And out of these shared activities, an awful lot of good can come. It's still temporal good. It looks beyond that ultimately, but this emphasis on the conditions of work and the education that we can come about, that we can achieve just in working together on something that's worth doing. Matthew, could you say some concluding things, and then we'll end with a prayer?
It'd be my pleasure. I first want to thank our many guests today for your perspectives and for your contributions. I hope that you'll all consider visiting us again sometime. In conclusion, with our far-ranging conversations today, I just want to let everyone know that what we have set before us, whether you're one of the many, cradle Catholics, converts to Catholicism, or one of those filthy Protestants like myself.
Hey!
I want to let you know that we have more in common than we have that differentiates us. We have a great and glorious God. We have a great and glorious purpose to proclaim good news, both of the gospel and of the possibility of peace, even with our irreligious and non-Christian brothers and sisters here on the earth. We have the hard work to do of promoting a kinder, more caring world that is just and righteous. And this is all work we should be linking arms together to do joyfully. And so I'm thankful to all my brothers and sisters, both in the American Solidarity Party and that I've encountered through this show, who are doing that hard work with me. And hopefully my contributions are helpful to them. Thanks, Jim.
They certainly are. Let's end with today's gospel. Jesus was going through a field of grain on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick the heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "See, your disciples are doing what is unlawful to do on the Sabbath." He said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? How he went into the house of God and ate the bread of offering, which neither he nor his companions, but only the priests could lawfully eat. I say to you, something greater than the temple is here. If you knew what this meant, 'I desire mercy, not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned these innocent men. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." thanks to all the guests. We are united in our prayer, "Come, Lord Jesus, come." We'll return next week. Thank you so much for joining us.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.